The Tokyo trials dragged on for 2.5 years.
Sir William Webb was bending over backwards to give the best advantage to the Japanese lawyers. He wanted them to have the opportunity of really getting through with their point.
But for many American POWs, including Terrence Kirk and Bruce Elliott, their day in court would never come. Instead, they were served a gag order issued by the U.S. military.
I was told you don't be talking to the media, the newspapers. He said if you do and we find out about it, so you'll be court-martialed.
The original gag order was drawn up on orders from Washington to General MacArthur as the Philippines were being liberated in January, February 1945.
Author of the book Unjust Enrichment, Linda Getz Holmes has done extensive research on American POWs in the Pacific.
What puzzles me is why this order was then updated to September 5th, 1945. Prisoners being recovered from Japan were being also forced to sign this order.
They had you sign a gag order that you wouldn't talk about what happened to you as a POW.
That's right.
Why?
I never could figure that out. They never told us. And so, being a Marine, I did what I was told.
This is the gag order Terrence Kirk signed on 13 September 1945. It covered the pictures he'd risked his life to take.
Terrence had been told, you take these home, you put them in a drawer, you don't show them to anyone or you'll be court-martialed.
Despite the threat, the photographs did end up as evidence in the Tokyo trials.
Herbert Markowitz was the Navy doctor who was the POW camp doctor.
Imprisoned with Kirk at Nippon Steel, Dr. Markowitz helped take the pictures. He even appears in this one. Markowitz testified at the Tokyo trials and brought copies of Kirk's photographs with him.
And they asked him who took the pictures. He said he didn't know. I said, the dummy, he was in the picture.
Dr. Markowitz knew about this gag order, and I am quite sure that he made that statement in order to protect Terrence. Our government began taking steps to portray Japan as our democratic ally in Asia, our bulwark against communism.
For all of us, Linda Holmes was part of a couple of documentaries which appeared on the History Channel, and also one with Oliver North, and I think it's that one which tied in you with a gentleman who was here last September named Bob Donahue.
Bob Donahue, right.
Because I would not have known anybody was alive who actually covered the prosecution of the Japanese war criminals. But Bob was there at the main trial, and subsequently came here and spent a week here.
A whole week, that's right. He was here.
And I don't know if you know, he subsequently has passed away.
Yeah, I didn't know that he had died about 6 months ago.
Right.
Rolly told me that, yeah.
And interestingly enough, because of you, your book mentions Bob Donahue, that Bob was uniquely an individual where he did the Japanese war crimes trial, then went over to Nuremberg for the subsequent trial with Telford Taylor. He was dismissed from Telford Taylor's employment. And the final piece of his puzzle over Europe, he was then assigned to represent Baldur von Schirach's second in command at a trial in Dachau. He was so upset by being dismissed that he defended this guy with zeal, actually got an affidavit of Rudolf Hess in support of von Schirach, the only guy to ever get an affidavit, and he got an acquittal. So if you can imagine, this guy went from prosecuting the Japanese war crimes trial, Nuremberg, Dachau, got an acquittal of the #2 guy in the Nazi youth movement. Bob had quite a career.
He really did, and he was a great help to me.
How did you catch up with him?
Well, I learned about him from the chief researcher at the National Archives in College Park. And John Taylor knows everybody. He has the world's best Rolodex. And he talked about Donahue, and he said that Donahue knew why it was that the Japanese company CEOs were never brought to trial, they were never indicted. And I contacted him and subsequently visited him with him several times. And he told me that the Japanese CEOs were detained right at the end of the war, just as all the big German industrialists were detained. But unlike Germany, where, as I mentioned earlier up in Fredonia, Patton's tanks rolled all through Germany. They rolled right up to the city halls. They went in, they swept up all the Nazi documents. The Nazis had no time to dispose of anything, so we had a tremendous paper trail for Nuremberg. But the Japanese, the day after the emperor announced on the radio that we had to end the war and that they had to bear the unbearable, an order went out, a secret message went out, and the Japanese did not know that we had broken their diplomatic code. We broke it in 1939, so we were reading their diplomatic messages all through the war. And unlike the German and the British and the American, all their messages were very cryptic. But the Japanese, thinking no one was reading them, they're very long and detailed and very direct. And the message went out, secret message went out on August 16th, 1945, the day after the surrender. Destroy or burn all documents which might be embarrassing to us. And so all the important papers that might fall into our hands pretty much were destroyed, or more importantly, were hidden. And the Japanese just lied and said they had destroyed them or they got burned in our bombings or whatever. So when Donahue arrived with the chief prosecutor, Joseph Keenan, in Tokyo in December 1945, getting ready for the trials which opened in May 1946, Keenan said, okay, where are all the documents? And they said, well, we haven't really found many. And so we were very hampered that way, and by the fact that they lied and concealed things, we did not have enough of a paper trail. As Donahue said, they didn't have enough paperwork to sustain an indictment. So they released all these CEOs, and the weirdest thing that happened was that throughout the Tokyo war crimes trials, and when they got to the Class B and C trials that had to do with mistreatment of prisoners of war, not one Japanese company was mentioned, even though all of these prisoners were on company property and working in company factories, company shipyards, company mines. They were all operated by the companies. And not one company is named. And I thought that was rather peculiar. And I asked Donahue about it, and he said, well, there was kind of a little unwritten agreement that if they weren't going to indict the CEOs, they didn't mention the company names. And these men knew they were in camp number 5 at Osaka, but they didn't know that Nippon Steel ran that camp. I sat up till 2 in the morning so many times helping someone find, someone would write to me and I would help him find what company he had worked for.
By way of a backdrop, you wrote the book Unjust Enrichment, which has been critically acclaimed and wonderfully so. And it's the preface for those who probably didn't get a chance to read much about the article that appeared in the paper, but during World War II, Allied prisoners of war were used as slave labor by many of Japan's leading industrial companies, companies that are now household names like Mitsubishi, Kawasaki, Toyota. Allied prisoners were starved, beaten, tortured, while unwillingly and illegally serving Japan's war efforts. Those who survived returned home changed forever, but their suffering went unrecorded until now. Your book came out in
2001.
Literally 55 years after the war. We certainly knew about the slave labor in Europe.
Yes.
That was very much part of the trial, very well known, and they knew about Krupp, they knew about all of those that were potential defendants at the first trial and became defendants at the subsequent trial. Yet I must tell you, I read this was all new to me. And just the fact that there were American prisoners of war used for slave labor. We certainly knew about Bataan, we knew about all those other, which were awful, but kind of more of a concentration camp type arrangement. What led you into this?
Well, it was the serendipity, and of course, I think the newspaper background, when you discover a story that hasn't been told, and you want to get the facts and get the story out, I consider it my best piece of investigative reporting. But it was an Australian who had been on the Burma Railway, the bridge on the River Kwai, and he had family on Shelter Island, where I have my home. Eastern Long Island, little island off the end of Eastern Long Island. And he would come to visit, and you know the British, when they come to visit, they stay 2 months. And he was an Anglican, so he came to our little Episcopal church, and I got to know him quite well. And he had been a newspaper man at one point too, and we kind of really clicked. We just developed a very nice friendship, and we corresponded for about 8 years in between the visits. And after he died, his wife, who was his second wife, was looking in his bureau drawer, and here was a pile of letters that he had written home to his first wife. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the unnecessary cruelties the Japanese did was they wouldn't let the men receive their mail, even though sacks of mail were delivered to the camps, and the men could look through the slats in the commandant's headquarters, sometimes see letters addressed, packages addressed to them that they weren't allowed to have. So when they were liberated, and here he was in Thailand, and the whole countryside was teeming with armed Japanese who had just fled the camps, he sat, and a little American plane came in every day, brought mail, brought supplies, and took out mail. So he wrote 15 letters home to his wife, and it was the tone of those letters that drew me to want to write about these men, because the spirit, the indomitable spirit, the determination to look ahead, because if you dwell on the past, you are still a captive in your own mind. And he understood this right from the get-go, and so did his friends. And you know, his letters would be, today they found the remains of a POW chained to a tree in the jungle, and whoever was responsible will be found and punished. The next paragraph is, but you would love the costumes in the Kabuki Theater in Bangkok. You know, I mean, it was just incredible, the yin-yang with these people. And as I talked to him, and one of the most touching things is always, and Rocky found this out with his brother Tony, they don't almost never talk about their experience, but every once in a while, something will remind him. We were at Boy Scout Sunday in our church, and our priest had been an Eagle Scout, so he always had the scouts taking part in at the altar, collecting the plates and whatnot. And at coffee, Cecil said to me, you know, seeing all those scouts reminded me of an incident on the railway. And up went the attendant, because he never hardly talked about anything. And he said, we noticed that there was this one young Japanese guard who was always so nice to us. Every few days he would be in charge of our little group, and he was always so nice. He let us stop for water. He let us go tear little pages from our Bibles and roll up grass and light it and pretend it was a cigarette to slake our hunger a little bit. And we just didn't understand this. We weren't allowed to talk to him. But one day he started whistling very softly, and Cecil said the younger men in my little group looked at one another and smiled. And he said, I couldn't wait to get back to camp, find out why were you smiling? And they said that guard was whistling the International Jamboree tune from the 1936 Jamboree, which took place in the Netherlands. And it was his way of recognizing he had been a Boy Scout. Some of these young Australians must have been Boy Scouts too, and maybe one day their children would go to jamborees. I wrote that up for Scouting Magazine. They got 1,000 letters about that story, because one of the old editors at the magazine said, oh, well, we have the sheet music for that tune in our file. And they said, anybody who wants the sheet music, right? And they got 1,000 letters. So what happened to these people really resonated, and I think what particularly drew me to want to write about first the Burma Railwaymen, and there were 668 Americans on the Burma Railway, which most people don't know. They think of it as a British-Australian, but Texas Battalion was captured on Java. The survivors of the USS Houston, which was sunk off the coast of Java, they all became prisoners and were all sent to the railway. And these men were really living out the 11th commandment without labeling it. But their situation was so desperate, they realized early on, if they didn't help one another, they wouldn't, none of them would survive. And so that is how, even though 16,000 of them died on the Burma Railway, they helped each other, and they helped each other have the will to live. And then, when I was interviewing Cecil's battalion friends, because his entire Australian battalion was captured on Java, and those were the people I interviewed for my first book, they were saying after they finished the railway, they were sent to Japan. And I said, what did you do? Well, I was working in a shipyard, I was working in a mine, I thought, these guys weren't working for the Japanese army. They were working for companies. I was the first one. You would have to know my son Philip to know he designed my website, powslaves42.com. And he titled the page, Japan Incorporated's Dirty Little Secret, you know? And that was really what I exposed with Unjust Enrichment, the fact that these men were working for the companies. The company was paying the Japanese government 2 yen per day per man to use our prisoners, and they were in turn supposed to pay our prisoners Japanese soldiers' pay, and that's what they didn't do. So if anyone likes to calculate what they owe them in back wages, plus 60 years interest, plus a little workman's comp thrown in,
Sure.
It would be more than the $1 a day they got from our government for missed meals. So.
For a little background, the actual slave labor pool that was available for these Japanese companies really emanated from a short period of time where they were captured shortly, after the war started, and really were in place for the entire balance of the war. Right?
That's right, because the earliest captive I know of were Terence Kirk, who took those photographs, and some other Marines up in North China. They were guarding a diplomatic outpost, and on the night that Pearl Harbor was bombed, before the sunset, they were approached by a Japanese patrol and they had to surrender. And so he was almost 4 years. He was 3 years and 10 months, but the rest of them, within 6 months of Pearl Harbor, the entire Army of the Pacific was either killed or captured. So we had about more than 20,000 Americans as prisoners of war, and quite frankly, the Japanese never expected that number of the enemy to surrender. They didn't know what to do with them. They couldn't adequately feed them, and certainly didn't want to. They, were just going to feed them enough to keep them alive enough to work. And if somebody died, no problem. There was more where he came from. And eventually there were 36,000 Americans in Japanese military prison camps, all of which were on Japanese company property, with very few exceptions.
And to the Japanese culture, the fact that they even had 36,000 American POWs,
it was incomprehensible.
That's counterintuitive to their culture, isn't it?
Right, because they instructed their military people, you do not surrender. That's too dishonorable. You kill yourself before you surrender. The first Japanese they captured was a pilot who crashed in the harbor at Pearl Harbor, and he was unconscious, and they went out and got him before he woke up and could slit his throat. And he was the first captain, immediately became very cooperative, which is the other odd thing about Japanese prisoners of us. He immediately went up in airplanes and spotted emplacements and concealed things for our people. Most of the Japanese who became prisoner, and it was always a kind of an inadvertent thing with them. Most of them were in Australia. And the Red Cross said the odd thing was that throughout the entire war, not one inquiry was made from the Japanese government about their prisoners, not one package was sent, not one piece of mail. The families were told that, in effect, this man was dead. Even though they knew he wasn't dead, he was as good as dead. And I often wondered what happened to those Japanese when they were liberated. What kind of reception did they get back home? Because they were so dishonored and they felt so ashamed. And in an odd way, our government was ashamed that so many of our people were trapped in the Pacific with, in most cases, really lousy leadership, except for a few outstanding people like General Wainwright and General King and a few others. But a lot of the leadership, a lot of the higher officers in the Pacific had been sent there because they were, you know, unsuitable. They were kind of the second rank of competence, and a lot of them drank very heavily, which didn't help. And so, but there was shame on the part of our government, and I think that shame lasted. They certainly made our prisoners feel ashamed that they had been taken prisoner, and when they came home, many of them did not get anything. There was a troop ship that came into San Francisco, and here were these prisoners of war with other returning veterans, and here is the band on the dock and the mayor and families. They were kept on board until after dark. They were not allowed off the ship, and they were taken to Letterman Hospital and confined there for quite a while. But they weren't allowed, you know, a big welcome homecoming. In some ways, this happened to a lot of people. And the gag order I talked about earlier, where our government, and it was not uniformly applied, only some men on their way home were made to sign this, but they were told no radio interviews, no newspaper interviews, don't write your memoirs, don't show any photographs that you might have without permission from the military, and if you do, you'll spend the rest of your life in Leavenworth. And, you know, this absolutely put the clamp on me. There was one fellow who was in a bar in Detroit, and he was mouthing off about the Japanese. And a couple of FBI men came and tapped him on the shoulder and took him outside and reminded him that he wasn't supposed to be speaking. It's really...
At the time, because it happened so early on in the war where the American POW pool was created, was there a sense from the United States government that there was maybe a direct connect as to how we treated the West Coast Japanese, the internment camp? Was there a connect there?
Not that I know of, because we did not remove any Japanese from the West Coast until about at least 2 months after the Japanese had rounded up every single white man, woman, and child in Asia, including 14,000 Americans, had thrown them all into internment camps, where most of them slowly, you know, became more and more malnourished. But I don't think that there was the concern with our government was that so many of our people became prisoners of the Japanese, and we were aware that the Japanese Diet, the government, had not ratified the Geneva Conventions with reference to prisoners of war. So we hurriedly, in late December 1941, through the Spanish embassy, we sent a message to the Japanese and said, we are going to observe the Geneva Conventions, you know, with regard to prisoners of war, because we did have some Japanese as prisoners, and we hope you will do the same. Well, several weeks later, the Japanese replied, well, even though we didn't ratify that part of the Geneva Conventions, we will honor it mutatis mutandis, which really meant as long as it doesn't interfere with our laws. And as soon as they sent us that message, 2 weeks later, the Japanese government adopted a whole bunch of regulations about the treatment of prisoners of war. And that the companies who rented them had to provide medical, food, supposedly Red Cross visits, but they ignored that pretty well, and housing they had to provide completely for the prisoners they asked to have sent to their work sites. And I think that the fact that we kept inquiring, I think there were something like 258 separate messages that we relayed through the Swiss asking about treatment of prisoners, because we were hearing stories. A few prisoners escaped, and we were hearing stories about how badly they were being treated, and we were trying to inquire what steps the Japanese were taking to look after our prisoners. And I think very much in recognition that they really weren't able, even if they were willing, they weren't able to properly feed them all or give them medical attention. We got up a secret relief fund with the British and the Dutch, and we set it up through the Swiss bank, which was going to send money to all its branches in Asia that their workers could draw on and literally deliver supplies to these prison camps. And the Japanese said, oh, no, 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 no. We will put the money in our bank and we will do the exchange rate, make a little. And they bottled up the money and didn't release it. And that was 98 million Swiss francs. And we contributed over 6 million, which would be 54 million today. But what you're asking is, did we connect their treatment of our people with our removal of Japanese? I don't think for another reason that would have been so, because we did succeed in exchanging about 3,000 civilians.
How did that work, by the way? I know you mentioned it.
It was a wonderful book by P. Scott Corbett. It was published by Kent State University Press. I think it's in my bibliography in 1987, called Quiet Passages. And his father was one of the civilians who was successfully brought back here under that program. We had one office in the State Department that worked 24/7 around the clock trying to make arrangements to have secret spots where the Gripsol would go with Japanese civilians and we would exchange them. But the Japanese had to be willing to take them, and they had to be willing to go. A fair number of Japanese were willing to go back to Japan, but their government didn't want these little farmers and businessmen from California. They wanted their diplomats and their spies, and they were very selective. So it was very difficult to get up a list of people, but that was the idea. We were hoping to exchange enough of their civilians to be willing to go to Japan, because the Japanese civilian, the adults, were not American citizens. They weren't allowed to be citizens until 1956. So they were United States residents of Japanese descent. Their children were citizens. And it was their children growing up and becoming politicians and lawyers that demanded the apology and the $20,000 each from our government. But that was how that program was intended to work. We called them relocation centers. The Japanese children growing up and becoming politicians called them concentration camps. But no Japanese I know of died of starvation. In fact, when they had their exhibit, and Ellis Island was one place they set up this mock exhibit of camp, they said, oh, you could tell it was Tuesday because it was meatloaf. I mean, our people would have loved to get meatloaf on a Tuesday, but they were relocated mostly because we were totally panicked after Pearl Harbor, and Japan controlled the Pacific for 6 months until June of '42 in the Battle of Midway, and that half of that fleet was headed to the West Coast when we intercepted them at Midway. But our people were terrified because we did not know who among the Japanese were loyal to our government or who were doing espionage for the Japanese government. And there were just enough incidents where the FBI would search a Japanese person's home in California and find the kitchen with 2 refrigerators. One had food in it, the other had a whole wireless set. And they were so worried about what to do. They felt the West Coast was so vulnerable. People I know sat around their radios every night waiting for the Japanese to invade. And, you know, a submarine did shell oil fields in California. And so there was so much panic, and we had during the 1930s and early 40s, we had so much trouble on the East Coast with German spies and German espionage that we were sure that the West Coast would have, and at night I'd see people up in the hills signaling to the Japanese submarines. I mean, it was a very nervous time, and our government didn't know what else to do but just remove Japanese from the West Coast. The ones who lived in Chicago stayed where they were. The ones who lived in the East Coast pretty well stayed where they were, but it was the West Coast.
Just as an aside, we had Fred Korematsu.
Oh yes, did he come?
Yeah, he was here, so that was a...
Yeah, he was the leader of the movement as a child growing up and feeling the injustice and feeling the pain of the families, because they were baffled, a lot of them, but there were some among them who really felt a great loyalty to Japan and said so.
You use a term in the book, Unjust Enrichment, and I'm going to absolutely butcher this, is Butsu? Z-A-I?
Zaibatsu.
I just did.
That's all right, yes, you're allowed. You don't have to speak Japanese.
Define that for
The
us.
Zaibatsu were like the cartel. They were a group of powerful, rich Japanese companies that had interlocking directorates. And there would be people from Mitsui sitting on Mitsubishi's board and whatnot, and they controlled the industries of Japan.
And it's,
Excuse me.
and it's that group which Bob Donahue said, that's the one where there's not enough documentation to indict.
Right.
And it's that group which, of course, you indict in your book.
Yeah, I expose and
Exactly.
yeah.
And have subsequently led to potential claims, some of which have had some degrees of success. Do you get a sense today, well, let me back up. Back during the time of the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo War Crimes Trial, that there was any sense among the, even the American prosecutors, that they were guilty but for the fact there was not enough documents? Or
Yes.
was it strictly political?
No, well, Donahue, regretfully, we had to notify Mr. Keenan. He and one other investigator were really the lead ones looking for enough documentation to indict these CEOs, because they knew Mitsui had loaned the Japanese government billions of dollars for the prosecution of the war, and of course they were aware, and they had enough depositions from American POWs that our people had been forced to work and war work for the Japanese, and that they had profited from this because they had war quotas that they had to meet. And one memorandum I have in my book, they had to make monthly reports to Tokyo, to the Prisoner of War Management Bureau, and this one Mitsui company manager said, "Oh, our production has never been so good and as it has been since we got these white prisoners." You know, and for one thing, by the time our prisoners were in a lot of these company work sites, all of the young Japanese educated workers were in the military, and they had the young kids and the old farmers, and a lot of the Japanese were illiterate, and they couldn't read the instruction manuals, but our people could read them. You know? But that was it. Donahue said that we so regretted we could not indict them. They didn't meet the level. We couldn't find paperwork to rise to the level of being involved in the planning and prosecution of the war, which was the Class A criterion. But he said to me, I always felt that they could have and should have been put on trial for mistreatment of prisoners of war, which occurred on their property.
How much you get a sense that General MacArthur, who was, of course, in charge of the Far East, was somewhat relieved that that case was not documented against the industrialists, knowing that he's got to rebuild Japan?
There's a very funny meeting that I talk about because the guy wrote such a lengthy report. There was a man named William Sebald, spoke no Japanese, typical of the people on MacArthur's staff, and the Mitsui executives invited him to a power lunch in their boardroom, in the polished table and the crystal and whatnot. And they sat and they had him wrapped around their little finger. They told him, well, you know, you've told us that we have to step aside and we can't run our companies anymore and we have to dissolve, we have to break up, but we are the ones who know how to rebuild Japan. And if you don't let us, if you don't give us the opportunity to once again do this work and head these companies, we'll have to look elsewhere for help, meaning Russia. And this panicked our people so much, and this was Sebald's recommendation to me. He was MacArthur's political advisor, and his recommendation was, we really should let these folks, you know, run their companies again because they know how to rebuild Japan. And I think you're right. I think MacArthur thought it was politically very expedient to just let these people do their thing, and because initially we were quite punitive, and we were not willing to give a lot of aid to the Japanese companies. We were sort of letting Japanese people, and so that was our goal. It was a Cold War expedient, I think, as much as anything else.
Found a little bit of that in the Nuremberg trials, when towards 1948-49 there was a lot of pressure on the prosecutors, the subsequent trials, to simply move it along because we really do want Germany rebuilt. And the Marshall Plan had kicked in, and there was a distraction. The War Crimes Tribunal was a distraction at that point. How much did that, do you think, played in the Tokyo War Crimes?
Very much, very much, because for one thing, as the Japanese got more confident of their ability to manipulate our people, they got more and more demanding about having these trials over with and releasing the people who had already been convicted. And as I mentioned earlier, Sugamo prison was empty by 1958, even the people who had been sentenced for life. And, but the Japanese pushed so to get some of their people and their top diplomatic people out of prison that there were a couple of real top Class A war criminals that we had given long sentences to, and the Dutch wouldn't sign the 1951 peace treaty until they could be guaranteed that the Japanese would give them a decent compensation for the 23,000 Dutch men, women, and children who died as civilians in these awful Japanese internment camps. So we said, all right, you can make a separate sidebar negotiation, but hurry up. And it gets to be 1955, and the Dutch still haven't added their signature to the 51 peace treaty, and they're trying to negotiate. They wanted 10 million yen from the Japanese, and the Japanese said, we'll give you 3 million. And we pushed the Dutch to accept that, and the Dutch were saying, well, of every newspaper, they went off page 35, they weren't even in the newspapers, and you know, got to be more than 2 years, and MacArthur would have liked to wrap it up much earlier, but our prosecutors were determined to bring everybody to trial who had been indicted, and that took, you know, that took a while.
I think there are 11 countries actually directly involved in that Japanese war crimes trial, and as opposed to, of course, the 4 in Nuremberg. Hirohito, you talked a little bit about him. Clearly, he became hands-off from a directive in Washington to the chagrin.
So, yes.
I just refer to the Z word.
Z word, like a dirty word.
But do you get, was Hirohito involved with the economics, the financial buildup during the war? And did he have an impact as to some of the even post-war, I don't know, rebuilding process? Did you get a sense of that?
Not as directly as of the companies like Mitsubishi loaning billions and other companies, you know, giving the Japanese government money. I don't know how much the Imperial Household contributed to the war effort, because there were, you know, there were lots of riches there, and there's still an awful lot down in their vault. But John, Pacific War historians like Ed Dray may have commented more, concentrated more, or learned more. All I know was that Hirohito was so involved in the planning of the war. How much he contributed toward buying material, I don't know, but he certainly was very involved in the planning. The trouble was, he met separately with his Army and Navy commanders. They never met all together, so he never got a whole picture from anyone. And that was quite a drawback, because they were all telling him what he wanted to hear a lot of the time. So.
And I really don't know that much about it, but was he a decision maker, or was he?
Allegedly, you know, the agreement or the plan would come from him as to, you know, whose advice to follow. The only time I know of for sure when he made the decision, when they were liberated, we were more angry by the end of the war at our own army than we were at the Americans. We would not have picked up bamboo spears and fought. We would not have done that. So that was, but the contention and the arguing went on and on and on. We dropped the first atom bomb. We waited. We thought for sure they'd surrender then. We waited 3 days, dropped the second atom bomb, and then there was 6 more days. And meanwhile, they were arguing, and finally, they said that we must bear the unbearable, and this is it, it's all done. Cooperate with the Americans. And the militants got wind of it, and he suspected, and his Chamberlain Kido certainly suspected that these people would hear about this recording and break into the palace and try to find it. And so he hid the records under the Empress's bed pillow, the decision.
That's an interesting story.
It is, isn't it? It's
that.
one of my favorites.
We've had a couple of individuals who were from Germany
and ordered, and MacArthur agreed with that. MacArthur also did not want to put the emperor on the witness stand or implicate him in the trials, make him the central figure of responsibility for everything that happened. Because after all, every command, everything was done in the emperor's name, and that is why this execution order that I got hold of was introduced, as it turned out, in the trial with no comment, because anybody who would cross-examine the British soldier who found that slightly burned copy in his old camp in Taiwan.
By the way, I was why don't you explain to the audience what that...
That was really, there was a policy that was established very early on by the Japanese military that any commandant of any POW camp, including civilian internment camps, if he thought he was going to have to surrender to the enemy, he was to kill all the prisoners first, or all the civilians first. And I guess the idea was very simple: no witnesses, no war crimes trials. But the order was so established that in October of 1943, our Navy began shelling Wake Island again, which after all had been our territory. And the Japanese admiral in charge of the prisoners on Wake Island thought that we were going to take it. So he, oh, it was so cruel, he marched these 98 American POWs down to the lagoon and said, "You are going to go home." And they thought a submarine was going to come and pick them up. And then suddenly, click, click, everybody was kneeling with their back to the land, and they were all shot. And a year later, in December of 1944, again, the commander of Little Palawan Island, which was sitting in the Pacific on the way to the Philippines, he thought for sure that General MacArthur was going to take Palawan Island on his way to the Philippines. So he arranged to have a phony air raid, and he had his guards herd 157 Marines into the tunnel, and they lit both ends of the tunnel, and they burned it. 11 of them escaped. And they were beginning to wonder, all the commanders were beginning to wonder, how can we act on our own without waiting for orders from Tokyo? When do we start executing the prisoners? And there was a message that went at the end of July, just make sure you annihilate them all, and you are not to leave any. Prisoners saw the machine guns on tripods being turned inward toward the camp. In Thailand, they were ordered to take off all their rings, their dog tags, anything metal that might survive burning. You didn't have to be a genius to know what was in store, that they were planning to kill them. It was only a matter of whatever day. And as a matter of fact, a group of officers were going to break out of a camp in Thailand, group of Australians, on August going to be annihilated. And the different mindset in Japan, plus the fact that a lot of Japanese felt, and that's the basis for the Yakusuni Shrine, is these people fought for their country, they fought nobly. We don't have to apologize for what they did. They were serving their emperor. End of story. And it's just a completely different feeling, and it really goes back to the fact that we really did not make the emperor even personal apologies when the Chinese and the Koreans got really angry at them and wanted to break off diplomatic relations. Then they issued personal apologies to their Asian neighbors, but never to the Americans.
You agree with Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb based on your research?
Yes, because they knew that it was going to take our ultimate weapon to make the Japanese surrender. Even the militants would see that the destruction was so terrible that, you know, they would. And also, Truman was aware of this order, this directive. I call it an execution order, but I've been corrected by an historian who documented a lot about the Tokyo trials and has written the definitive volumes on. And he says it was not a military, really dramatic, because the Japanese military people who were in charge of their government were not going to make any negotiation, although the Japanese were working with the Russians trying to help negotiate a surrender. So there was some, you know, diplomatic movement, but among the militants, the militarists who really ran the government, they were really not willing, and I think we knew the clock was ticking, and we knew this August 20th date in Burma and Thailand, and that would affect all the civilians in Sumatra and Java and whatnot, and then sequentially up, you know, in China and Taiwan and the home islands. It was just, we had to make that war end.
people are going to pick up this book, Unjust Enrichment, I'm sure, after today and read it. And what do you hope that they walk away with after having read this?
I hope that people would recognize more what our men went through and that they have not received justice of any sort. These men, so many of them say, I don't really want money from the Japanese companies, but I would like them to apologize for the way they treated us. That's part of it, but also I think now that when my book came out in 2001, the court cases were still alive in California, and subsequently the State and Justice Department lawyers insisted to the judges who were willing to hear these cases, which were being brought against specific Japanese companies by people who had worked for that company. And they insisted this will interfere with our foreign relations and our ally Japan, and we will embarrass the Japanese, and you can't hear these cases. And it's a moot question, it's an open question whether the company heads were included in the peace treaty that said we wouldn't sue any more Japanese entities. But the company people were never included in that planning and prosecution of the war. So there is a question whether they can, particularly where we know they were ordered to pay the men and still owe them that money. So there was a frustration that when my book was being published, there was hope that there might be some compensation, some gesture that would help bring a sense of justice to these men. And I think what has happened subsequently, particularly where the White House requested that the bills that were passed in Congress for our own government to finally make a gesture of about $20,000 to each surviving POW. We're all only talking about 700 people, that, you know, so many of them have died, that it was the White House, this current White House, that requested that that amendment be deleted from the defense bill, so that still it's our own government that is not allowing these men to have some gesture of recognition that they should be compensated for what they went through. That's perhaps what I hope most, is that people will have a better understanding. If anyone can find a way to make some Japanese feel obligated to do something, that would be very nice. Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Kawasaki, when you see a jet ski on Lake Chautauqua, think about that. They had 200 of our prisoners, and 100 of them died on Kawasaki property. It's the making any Japanese company and head feel that it would be the right thing to do for them to make some gesture. That would be nice. Making our State Department feel that they should at least bring up the subject. That would be very nice.
Well, it's just absolutely groundbreaking information you provided to the world, information which certainly had not been known to many. As we conclude, could you explain what you have around your neck?
Oh yes, this is the symbol of the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor, and they gave me a little gold-plated one as a gesture of recognition of all that I have tried to do and am still trying to do to help them feel that we appreciate what they did and we appreciate their suffering, because I don't think many of them feel that way. So that's it.
Well, we appreciate everything you've done and coming here today.
Oh, that was my pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Nice.
Thank you for the gift. So,
yeah.
Thank you. I know we have some time constraints, including Linda's, but what I'll do, if anybody has any specific questions, we're going to go off camera now, but feel free. But Linda, we can't thank you enough.
Oh, it was my pleasure, really, to be back in Chautauqua County and to be able to go through Buffalo again. It's just very nice, but I am so impressed with what you've done in just 5 years Rolly says, 5 years you've created all of this? It's really wonderful. It's such a tribute to wanting to preserve history. That's the best thing. And you have young people who come, and the kids are fascinated when one of our ex-POWs goes to a school and says what happened to them. They can't believe. When I was developing in New York, I was developing some of these photographs that are, where are they, page 78, 9. These are the photographs that one prisoner took secretly in captivity. He said to the medic there, take these men outdoors in the sunshine behind the barracks so the Japanese won't see us. Take all their clothes off. I want to photograph them as they are dying of malnutrition because they're being cremated and no one will ever know why they died. I want to make photographs. And when I took these to a photo shop in New York to have them reproduced, the girls came out, you know, with my order. They said, are these pictures of concentration camps? And I said, yes, the Japanese had concentrate. They did this to people too. It's just a total unawareness.
But certainly not after your book.
Not after you
left a real legacy for all of us. Again, thanks a million.
Thank you so much, Greg. It was just wonderful being here.
Saying it's a pleasure to present you Elizabeth Guest Holmes.
Oh, it is such an honor to be here, and it is so wonderful to be back in Chautauqua County. My Aunt Minnie, God rest her soul, always had a cottage at Chautauqua Lake, and my high school graduation present from my grandmother, who lived in North Evans and Buffalo, my graduation present was a flight on American Airlines to Buffalo and hotel. Ironic and quite wonderful that I'm here today as you do your Veterans Day program, because the new book that Rocky mentioned is about the mostly Bataan and Corregidor survivors who stumbled into Mitsubishi's huge factory complex on Veterans Day, November 11th, 1942. What an irony, and what a way to start my talk. Of course, we called it Armistice Day then, didn't we? Because we were still celebrating, we hoped, the war, the end of the war to end all wars, and isn't it too bad it wasn't? So as we approach Veterans Day 2006, and as we claim to honor the greatest generation, our World War II veterans, I'd like to focus on the men I consider the forgotten heroes of that war, prisoners of the Japanese in the Pacific who dared to try and stay alive for 3.5 years of brutal captivity when for some death might have been preferable. And that is the way an Australian general described the men who survived on the Burma Railway. And by the way, there were 668 Americans building that darn railway. How so many of our people became prisoners so soon, why they were treated so badly by the Japanese and then by our own government, and how some leaders in Congress are still trying to correct those wrongs. That will be my way of honoring those men by telling a bit of their story to you today. Within 6 months of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, General Douglas MacArthur's entire Army of the Pacific was either killed or captured. It was the worst defeat in American military history. Never before or since had so many of our people been taken prisoner by an enemy at one time. By late May 1942, over 20,000 Americans were suffering in Japanese prison camps, and not all of them were military personnel. The Japanese considered the civilian construction workers captured on Wake and Guam Islands on Christmas Eve 1941, they considered them insurgent guerrillas, assuming that our construction workers were like their construction workers, which for several previous years had been all over the Pacific, intelligence personnel and military personnel wearing construction coveralls. So they just assumed that our construction workers were spies too. And it took an act of Congress in 1988 to finally get those men veterans benefits, and that's why I chose a Wake Island construction worker, a young man from Utah, to be on the cover of my book. And all through the war, he was wearing this tattered shirt. Before we removed civilians of Japanese descent from our West Coast for security reasons, the Japanese had already rounded up every white man, woman, and child in Asia, including nearly 14,000 Americans, and had thrown them all into internment camps, where many of them starved slowly for the rest of the war. The Dutch lost 23,000 men, women, and children in those camps. And quite a few Americans died also. It was our government which worked so hard to exchange civilians. We were hoping to exchange the Japanese we removed from the West Coast for the Americans in Japanese camps. But the Japanese government put so many roadblocks in our way that we really only succeeded in retrieving about 3,000 people. Eventually, over 36,000 American soldiers, sailors, Marines, civilian merchant mariners, and construction workers, and a few businessmen became prisoners of the Japanese, and nearly 40% of them died in Japanese hands. By contrast, of the nearly 94,000 American military personnel captured by the Nazis, just 1% died in captivity. The main reason for this stark discrepancy is that the Germans scrupulously observed the 1929 Geneva Conventions with regard to prisoners of war, mostly to assure protection of the large number of German prisoners in our hands. While the Japanese government would not ratify the POW Convention, claiming that no Japanese would willingly dishonor himself by being taken prisoner, so the convention had no interest for them. But a fact often overlooked by historians is that the Japanese government did ratify the 1929 Geneva Conventions with respect to the Red Cross, and was bound to honor those protocols, which they consistently failed to do, by withholding Red Cross boxes which were actually delivered to the camps and then locked up in the commandant's office. And this happened all over the home islands and all over Asia. Those boxes contained medicines, food, surgical instruments, and even toilet paper. Japanese captors allowed thousands of Allied POWs to die from malnutrition and the untreated diseases associated with it. By refusing to allow Red Cross visitors or even mail delivery to the prisoners, the Japanese visited additional unnecessary cruelties on our Pacific POWs, who suffered the longest captivity any place in World War II, 3 years and nearly 10 months. And the lucky ones who survived never regained full health. Rocky can tell you that about his brother. They suffered from the health problems and disabilities associated with prolonged malnutrition for the rest of their lives. Starvation stalked our soldiers even before they were captured on their most famous holdout, Bataan, where they fought the Japanese for 5 months until food and ammunition ran out in April 1942. Back home, their families formed the Bataan Relief Organization, which became the Bataan Families Organization and eventually morphed post-war into the Bataan Veterans Organization and finally the American Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor, which remains the largest organization of Pacific War POWs in the country. While their loved ones were battling the Japanese, The families were packing and sending boxes with food and supplies, unaware that they were not being delivered. And the worst moment for our embattled Americans had to be when they happened to pick up a shortwave radio broadcast and heard our own Secretary of War saying, quote, "Sometimes men must be sacrificed." And they knew they were those men. A year later, when Easter Sunday fell on April 9th, the day Bataan surrendered, the families wrote to President Roosevelt and asked, "Please, Mr. President, in your Easter radio message and prayers, will you remember the men who gave their lives on Bataan and those now suffering as prisoners of war?" Do you know what FDR wrote back? No, N-O, Europe first. Nothing must interfere or distract the American people from Hitler. And that was his attitude throughout the war, except when he ordered the Navy to resupply the Marines on Guadalcanal. Later, he said, "I and I alone will decide how much the American people learn about how the Japanese are treating our prisoners," which explains why so many of our ex-POWs got funny looks from family and friends when they came home and tried to talk about their experience. People thought they were crazy because very little had been in the local papers about their wartime sufferings. And then the military told many of them to shut up. More about that later. With all these skilled white prisoners in Japanese custody, Japan's companies were clamoring to use them in factories, shipyards, and mines in the home islands and throughout occupied Asia. By February 1942, the Japanese government had passed a series of regulations about the use of POWs, requiring companies to pay the Imperial Japanese Army 2 yen per man per day, which was a pretty good sum back in 1942, for renting each POW. Companies were also responsible for housing, feeding, medical care, and safety of the prisoners. Just about all POW camps were actually on company property. And the companies were supposed to pay the prisoners Japanese soldiers' pay according to rank. All of the above were honored more in the breach than the observance. POW officers were often beaten until they would sign pay slips saying the men had been paid when they hadn't. And the past national commander of the Defenders of Bataan and Corregidor said to me, "Linda, till I read your book, I didn't know they were supposed to pay us." Mitsubishi was one of the first companies to request the use of white POWs, especially Americans, and all of these companies asked especially for Americans. Rocky's brother Anthony was sent to Mitsubishi's copper mine at Hanawa in northern Japan, where the POWs were shocked to see that the Japanese were literally still using medieval mining methods. And I just want to read you what one of Anthony's fellow prisoners said later. "The mine was cold and damp and had icicles hanging from the ceiling. The prisoners had to walk over 2 miles up a steep mountain road to get to the mine. On one stretch of the road, there was a cut in the mountain where the wind and snow were blinding. It gets very cold in northern Japan. So we used a rope and would go hand by hand to keep from getting lost. During the few months when snow wasn't on the ground, the POWs would try to catch grasshoppers along the way in a desperate search for protein to add to their watery soup. They had no midday meal from the company." Kenneth Calvert also remembered the time ammonia leaked from pipes in the company's refrigeration plant into the vat of soup, but it was served to the POWs anyway. But what the prisoners remembered most was the terrible cold, how they were only allowed 2 hours of heat per day, and how when they tried to bring a few scrap timbers from the mine to put in the little barrack stove, the company guards would take them from them. "At times I thought I was going to freeze to death," one man said. "We weren't even expected to live," another said. "Today I'm totally disabled thanks to the Japs and especially Mitsubishi. It was a terrible 3.5 years. I can't describe it fully, and I know people can't imagine it." And I think Rocky will tell you that's very true. You won't find one Allied ex-POW who doesn't say without hesitation that the atom bomb saved their lives. It took 50 years for the father of the hydrogen bomb, Edward Teller, to understand that the Japanese had a standing order to kill all prisoners, including civilian internees, before surrendering. That was a policy which had been carried out on Wake Island in 1943 with the execution of 98 POWs because the commandant saw our Navy shelling Wake Island and they thought that we were going to retake Wake Island, which we actually never did, but he executed the POWs because that was the policy. And Palawan Island, where in December 1944, they burned alive 157 Marine prisoners, again, assuming MacArthur sailing toward the Philippines would naturally take Palawan Island, which was in the middle there. And he didn't, he went around it, but the commandant thought he was going to land on Palawan, so he got rid of all the Marine prisoners by faking an air raid, and then they made them go down in the air raid tunnel, and then they set fire to both ends of the tunnel. And they almost succeeded in wiping out all the civilian internees in February 1945 as our troops approached Manila. Only daring rescue saved them, along with the POWs at Cabanatuan. And I don't know if you saw the movie Ghost Soldiers or read, the book, but that was all very true. After hearing ex-POWs testify for a whole day about machine guns being turned inward on the camps during the summer of 1945, and this was universally happening, whispered warnings from friendly guards about what was in store for the prisoners, and intercepted Japanese messages ordering the killing to start by August 20th, 1945, with the aim, quote, to annihilate them all and not to leave any traces. I have that document in the book. Dr. Teller, in a dramatic moment at a symposium at the Admiral Nimitz National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas, in March 1995, swept aside his prepared text and stated, "Overnight, I have realized an unshakable fact. We had to come to the aid of prisoners of war. We had to make peace." I was in that auditorium when he said that, and I wrote it up for an Australian newspaper. I'm leaving a copy with Rocky. And I looked around, and there were tears coming down the face of all these World War II veterans who were gathered for this symposium. One man told me later, several told me later, I waited 50 years to hear somebody say that. But peace came at a very high price for our Pacific ex-POWs. Many of them were ordered to sign what I call a gag order, and I got a copy of this from a Marine. And it looks quite innocuous because it was drafted when the war was still on and we were liberating people from the Philippines. And it was several months later before the war ended. And this just says, don't talk about anyone who might have helped you escape because that could put that person in danger. But then they said, don't write about your experiences, don't give newspaper or radio interviews discussing captivity experiences, and you're not allowed to publish your memoirs without permission from the military. One brave Marine, Terrence Kirk, waited 38 years to get up the courage to self-publish a book containing the photos he had taken secretly in captivity, hoping they could be used at war crimes trials to show POWs dying from starvation and disease, and he gave me permission to use his pictures in my book. When he showed them to military personnel upon his release and what he went through to make a little cardboard box camera like his brother had shown him in Boy Scouts, and he got a friendly Japanese-American guard to go to the local hospital and steal some x-ray plates so that he could do these 5 photographs. and then he crawled under the Japanese soldier's shower to have a dark room to develop these. And he was able to make several copies. He wanted to give them to Army intelligence, Navy intelligence, Marine intelligence, because what kept these men alive was the faith that there would be war crimes trials. And he thought these photos will show why these men died, because they're dying and they're being cremated and no one will ever know. And when he got down to Yokohama on his way home, he showed these photographs, and you know what they said? You take these home, put them in a drawer, and don't dare show them to anyone, or you'll be court-martialed. Can you imagine telling that to somebody who's just had 3 years of captivity? Some veterans felt so constrained by these instructions that they felt they couldn't even tell their VA doctors why they continued to have medical problems. They knew they were related to what happened to them in captivity, but they were afraid, they felt they were constrained that they couldn't even discuss it with their doctors. And then there were the Tokyo war crimes trials. Rocky asked me, why were those trials so different from Nuremberg? Former State Department spokesman Harding Carter once termed the Tokyo trials the dog that did not bark. It was a good old Tennessee phrase which pretty well sums up the tone and outcome of those trials. For openers, the caliber of judges and prosecutors we sent to Tokyo was so different from the lawyers we selected to represent the United States in Nuremberg. Robert Jackson, after all, was already a top judge and a justice of the Supreme Court when he was chosen to be chief prosecutor of the Nazis. He worked with British and French top jurists in London for quite a while before the trials opened to develop the very important and groundbreaking concept of command responsibility. But when it came time to assemble the legal team for the Tokyo trials, we sent people who were either controversial or had very limited experience. Although Joseph Keenan, like Robert Jackson, was part of President Roosevelt's inner circle, a top criminal lawyer in the Justice Department and a graduate of Harvard Law School, he was thought to be a heavy drinker whose flamboyance often got the best of him. As one observer put it, quote, his knowledge of Asian affairs did not extend beyond chow mein. Some believed President Truman gave Keenan the Tokyo assignment to ease him out of the White House because Truman inherited all Roosevelt's cronies. His own chief of staff said Keenan was so controversial, we got off on the wrong foot. He did not measure up to the job. And then the Truman administration chose John Higgins, a Massachusetts judge whose limited experience was entirely within his own state, to be our nation's judge at Tokyo, to sit on the panel. Although he grew in stature as the trials progressed, the United States message to our allies was clear. The Tokyo trials were just not that important to us. It was common knowledge that General MacArthur, after seeing to it that Japan's General Yamashita was punished for the sacking of Manila, he would just as soon have called it a day as far as prosecuting Japanese war criminals were concerned. Meanwhile, other allied nations were appointing their top judges to Tokyo. Australia sent Sir William Webb, who spoke fluent Japanese, unlike just about all the other judges, who had just presided over trials at Singapore, and who was selected to be chief judge at Tokyo. Britain sent its leading barrister. China sent the chief prosecutor of the Shanghai High Court, an honors graduate of Stanford and the University of Chicago. France sent the chief prosecutor of Versailles. The Soviets sent their commissar of justice. India sent its most prominent justice, as did New Zealand. The Netherlands sent its leading professor of law. The Philippines sent its former attorney general, a member of its Supreme Court. All justices, except India's Judge Radhipinam Pal, signed a statement pledging to pursue justice without fear or favor in the Tokyo trials. Pal voted against every conviction or death sentence for the next 2 years. And later, he told a group of reporters that he admired the Japanese for showing India how to get rid of white colonial rule. So we had a ringer on the Tokyo bench right from the start. But the two greatest drawbacks to achieving justice in the aftermath of the Pacific War were the constraints placed on prosecutor Keenan and the ample opportunity the Japanese had to destroy incriminating evidence in the weeks between surrender and occupation, and those were 3 very crucial weeks. So unlike the situation in Germany, where our tanks rolled into cities and right up to Nazi headquarters, and we seized a huge paper trail. As Keenan prepared to board the plane in Washington with Robert Donahue at his side, a courier drove up with an envelope containing 2 instructions from the White House. Under no circumstances was Emperor Hirohito to be implicated or placed on the witness stand, and Keenan would be allowed to cross-examine Tojo. Can you just imagine if Hitler had been alive, you could be sure Robert Jackson would have had him on the witness stand. When Sir William Webb learned that the U.S. would not allow Hirohito to be tried at Tokyo, he threatened to conduct his own separate trial, and for several weeks he was sent back to Australia to cool off. And the Russians were furious that no Japanese company heads were put on trial for their most obvious roles in the planning and prosecution of the war. Mitsui, which until recently was the 3rd richest company in the world, lent the Japanese government billions to finance the war. Robert Donahue told me that he and a fellow investigator tried very hard to establish enough of a paper trail to indict the detained company heads for Class A trials, but everyone said they had followed the Japanese government's August 16, 1945 directive, that was the day after the emperor announced surrender, to destroy any documents, quote, which might be embarrassing to us, unquote, and that's what the secret message said. Another investigator, William Gill, sent to search for evidence at company POW campsites, said time and time again the Americans were told, oh, our documents were destroyed in the bombings, or oh, we were told to destroy everything, and we did. We knew they were lying, Gill said, but what could we do? We came away empty-handed. Yet when ex-POW Sergeant Frank Steckline was hurriedly sent to his former camp, Mitsui's huge Omuta coal mine, which was built by American engineers in 1917, by the way, because the POW quarters were being dismantled and bulldozed, he was greeted by the company manager, and I know you can't see this, but it's in, here he is with the company manager. Frank is still in his Army uniform, and the company manager immediately opened a file drawer and pulled out photos of Frank and his fellow POWs, and then he presented Frank with a nice silk kimono, and here's Frank receiving his kimono. So the Japanese corporate CEOs, whose employees had so ruthlessly starved, beaten, and used our POWs for slave labor, were released from detention. But Donahue told me he believed those CEOs could have and should have been tried in the Class B and C trials, which concerned the mistreatment of prisoners of war, which after all had happened on company property. Just one American ex-POW actually was allowed to testify for one day at Tokyo. Sam Moody noticed that while he was being questioned, few of the Japanese defendants listed, and this is a quote, many were asleep. Tojo was writing on a pad of paper. 3 other ex-POWs have been brought to Tokyo with the promise of testifying. None had the chance. Their written depositions were merely entered into the record. William Bray told me earlier this week, by chance he happened to call me up, that because a prosecutor was from Salinas, California, he insisted that Salinas resident Bray come to Tokyo. He had to have an ex-POW from his hometown in Tokyo. And William said, I don't want to go. I just found a nice job. And he was told he would only be in Japan for a couple of weeks. He was made to stay there 18 months, and he lost his job back home. They did pay me well, but I had a terrible time finding another job, he told me. By far the most glaring lack of justice our ex-POWs suffered, which persists to this day, is over the issue of compensation. On their way home in 1945, many ex-POWs sat with military personnel who helped them fill out elaborate and detailed claim forms listing every possession the Japanese had taken from them, injuries they suffered, deprivations of food and medicine, all to be assigned a dollar value. They added them up, and some of these totals came to many, many thousands of dollars, and they got all excited. They were assured that they could file their claims against the Japanese government and that compensation would come from Japanese assets frozen here in the U.S. at the war's outbreak. For 2 years, some ex-POWs wrote to Washington asking when their claims were to be acted upon. They were told the framework was still being established, the paperwork was being set up. Finally, in 1948, as the Tokyo trials were winding down, Congress passed the first War Claims Act, using a regulation from the Army Field Manual, which provided a soldier on field maneuvers $1 for each day of missed meals while on bivouac. So our Pacific POWs, who had spent 3.5 years watching comrades die of malnutrition, and who had eaten grasshoppers, snakes, snails, or anything else they could find to stay alive, received this. If he had been a POW for 3,158 days, an ex-POW received $3,158. And after the 1951 Treaty of Peace was signed, cutting ex-POWs out of the opportunity to file any claims against Japan, Congress passed the Second War Claims Act in 1952, providing an extra generous $1.50 per day of captivity to each POW for, quote, pain, suffering, and forced labor. And that was it. Even when secret relief funds contributed by the American, British, and Dutch governments through the Swiss bank were discovered bottled up in Japan's Yokohama Bank post-war and turned over to the International Committee of the Red Cross in 1955 for distribution to allied nations whose military people had suffered as POWs, the United States was the only nation of all the allied nations which declined to take our share of those funds, which would amount to about $54 million today. And those funds were intended for the post-war comfort of our ex-POWs, just to help make their lives a little more pleasant than they had been. The ex-POW's sense of hurt and frustration turned to rage when Congress voted to give $20,000 to each civilian of Japanese descent interned here in the U.S., and President Reagan issued a formal apology on behalf of our government. But no one in the White House or State Department urged the Japanese government to issue a similar apology or to offer any compensation to the thousands of Americans and other Allied prisoners who had been brutalized on Japanese soil or elsewhere in its empire. During the 1990s, 2 of Japan's prime ministers issued personal apologies, which were not official government apologies, personal apologies and regrets to its Asian neighbors, but not to Americans because no one asked them to. And also during the 1990s, every allied nation except the United States has made an ex gratia payment of between $20,000 and $24,000 to its surviving ex-POWs in recognition of the fact that the Japanese government and companies are unlikely to do so in their lifetimes. And that's Britain, Canada, Australia, the Isle of Man, New Zealand, all of the Netherlands, all the other major allied nations did that, except the United States. Between 2000 and 2002, repeated attempts were made by California lawyers and willing judges in that state to hear claims brought by ex-POWs against Japanese companies which used them for slave labor and which do business in California as provided by newly enacted California laws. If you do business in the state and you've used anyone for slave labor or forced labor, that person can sue you in California courts. And people brought claims against German companies. And by the way, 6,000 German companies have contributed to that large fund to compensate people who did forced labor or slave labor. The German people don't know that no Japanese. But state and Justice Department lawyers at your taxpayer expense flew to California and successfully argued that judges could not hear such cases because it would interfere with our foreign relations and upset our Japanese allies. But some persistent and courageous congressional leaders have tried again repeatedly to get legislation enacted for our government to make a belated gesture of compensation to our ex-POWs. A bill co-sponsored by Representatives Mike Honda and Dana Rohrabacher of California was bottled up in committee and never got to the floor before Congress adjourned in 2002. Similar bills in 2003 passed both the House and the Senate, but were deleted from the Defense Appropriations budget at the request of the White House. Even the Dean of the Senate, Robert Byrd of West Virginia, said he could not recall another occasion when a bill passed both houses of Congress and was deleted by the conference committee. Now in this session of Congress, bills sponsored by Representative Duncan Hunter of California and 44 co-sponsors in the House, sorry to say your Brian Higgins is not one of them. We hope to change that before. And in the Senate by Senators Hatch of Utah and Biden of Delaware, also with wide support. Those bills were earmarked for passage, but somehow they were again deleted from the Defense Appropriations budget. The Japanese lobby is the second largest in Washington, after the Israeli lobby and just ahead of the pharmaceutical lobby. Japan pays its top lobbying firm, Hogan and Hartson, about $60 per month to lobby Congress on the sole matter of historical issues relating to World War II. But Duncan Hunter says he will reintroduce his bill for a floor vote, not attaching it to any appropriation budget, but just bring it to the floor. He says he's going to do that after Congress reconvenes on November 13th. Now that would be a nice Veterans Day recognition for just about 700 ex-POWs of the Pacific who are still alive. Thank you very much. If anybody has a question or a thought that comes into mind you'd like to ask or mention? Yes, sir.
Did I misunderstand? Did you say $60 a month?
$60,000 a month.
I just
yes.
heard 12,000.
60,000. Oh,
that sounds better.
Yeah.
Words.
Yes, sir. Roland.
What was MacArthur's role in the trials? Did he want to soft pedal the trials? Was he involved in that?
He did. And he, as you know, as Supreme Commander, he was Supreme Commander of the Tokyo War Crimes trials. So supposedly, you know, he was setting all the criteria and all the policies. He was getting his instructions from Washington mostly. But, and he had a very clever way of, he'd receive a directive from Washington and he'd turn around immediately, issue his own, as if this had been his, you know. But he did say, when they were debating about Hirohito, he was known to say, send me 1 million more men to occupy Japan if you put him on the witness stand, because it will destabilize the country. He may have only been partly right, because John Dower, in the book he won a Pulitzer for, Embracing Defeat, which is a fascinating book about how the Japanese coped with our occupation, he noted that by the end of the war, 50% of the Japanese would have just as soon seen Hirohito abdicate, because most of them know what a lot of us still don't know, is how deeply involved Hirohito was with the day-to-day operations of the Pacific War, with the planning and prosecution of the war, that Ed Dre, who's a wonderful Pacific historian, tells about how in the Battle of Bataan, and the Japanese lost 10,000 men taking Bataan, Hirohito was, you know, sending messages to the commander, shouldn't we send more troops? No, 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 dear Emperor, the terrain is bad and it's lumpy and we're having problems. 2 weeks later, he's saying, shouldn't we send more troops? And so he was very involved day to day. And yet MacArthur felt that if we put him on the witness stand, it would just wreak havoc. However, in the long run, I think everybody sees that the Japanese were not made to feel a sense of guilt or a need to apologize because their emperor was not made to formally apologize publicly or to account for any of the behavior under his throne. And so it's, but yes, MacArthur did, and one thing, a B-29 aviator I know was just livid. He gave me this list. 31 Japanese officers confessed at the trials to being the one who personally had the honor of beheading an American aviator. 31 trials, 31 death convictions, and MacArthur commuted them all. And as you may know, even there were a few death sentences initially. Other people who were sentenced to death or to life in prison or 8 years of hard labor, all of those were eventually commuted not only by us in those first few years after the trials ended, but by the Japanese when they took over control in 1952. They commuted all the rest of them, and Sugamo prison was closed in 1958 because it was empty. So, you know, the general feeling in Japan has been they do not need to apologize, and no one in our State Department has asked them to. So yeah, he was. Yes, sir.
Did you ever think back in 1945 that any American would ever buy a Japanese car?
Well, I'll tell you, Rocky was telling me we were over at the Lighthouse Museum, and we were talking about how somebody's son said he had bought a Japanese car, and the Pacific veteran said, "Don't park it near my driveway." But yeah, how these men feel, how people like Rocky's brother and these guys that mucked in, because Mitsubishi used more prisoners than anyone else except maybe Mitsui, you know, how they feel riding down a road behind a truck that says Mitsubishi. You know, it just brings back so many memories, and yet, you know, we have accommodated them and made it possible for them to build factories and be part of the American dream. So, but yeah, I don't think people anticipated the amount of assistance that we gave to Japan for its recovery. And my contention is these companies had a leg up on big post-war profits because they had all this free skilled labor during World War II that they didn't pay for, except paying the government for the use of the men. So I just figure they still owe them. Maybe they should all give them a car. Any other? Yes, sir.
That early